Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. Mr. Luxale.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Common and Ms. McLeod for being here today. I've got a little example here. So if I buy a cup of coffee in cash, it costs me $5. If I buy a cup of coffee with card, it costs me up to $5.08. Why?
Well, it would also depend on the cost of the cash. Let's just assume a business that was only accepting cash. You'd probably be paying $5.20 for the coffee. You'd just be handing over the cash and the coins, because the 4% of the cost of the coffee is embedded into the higher prices. It doesn't
cost me $5.20, it costs me $5.
It's a difficult comparison to make, Mr. Laxale, because you have to understand that with cash, I think there was some research that was published in the last couple of days, which shows that, and I've seen surveys that are substantially higher than this, but it equates the cost of cash acceptance at about 4%. I think it puts buy now, pay later at 8%. The cost of electronic payments is less than half of that. I'm happy to talk about the electronic payments market in as much detail. Typically, if a business, yes, customers have never paid a surcharge for cash, but the cost of carrying that cash at a business level, just like any other input cost, the cost of the coffee beans, the milk, is embedded into the price of the cost. So it's not a like for like comparison.
It's still $5 out of my bank account compared to $5.08 out of my bank account. They're both money. I think in 2024 it is like for like.
If the cost of the good is higher than the surcharge,
why are
then
costs embedded for cash but not embedded for digital?
Because the entire mechanism of electronic payments domestically and globally, and I'm happy to talk about it in as much detail as you'd like, historically is the way that it's charged. And Australia, unlike Europe, allows merchant surcharging or business surcharging. They are able to surcharge the cost of the acceptance. I think there's a reasonable hypothesis that at least some businesses are surcharging more than the cost of acceptance, but there is no data on that. That is one of the things that the RBA is analysing. The cost of acceptance of electronic payments has fallen by more than 30%. We are one of the lowest, if not the lowest, cost of acceptance markets in the world. We're a fraction, as an example, of the US or Canada. The domestic payment system is extremely efficient. The Reserve Bank, as I know Governor Bullock spoke about recently, has announced a review. I have no doubt, as there has been over the last 2 decades, there will be ongoing pressure to reduce interchange. There's a number of different elements about what shows up as $5.08. There's different parts that contribute to that. I've no doubt that will continue as marginal costs in businesses continue to reduce. But I mean, fundamentally, the electronic payments infrastructure and I think the service and the commercial outcomes for the economy and the industry as a whole are extremely efficient and competitive. And if I may, I don't think it's appropriate when others describe that in terms such as a rort. I don't think that's factually correct.
So you mentioned some of the costs involved in your business dealing with cash. You've come out publicly and said that costs $350 million. You've mentioned you're just giving a lifeline to Armour Guard and you're contributing. You embed that in your cost of business to a small business, but you treat digital differently. And I guess that's what I'm trying to understand. Why do you treat digital differently to what you do for cash?
Well, I mean, we don't, but let me try to go back.
You do. Like, these are 2 different figures, right? Like, you said that this was $5.20. That's not $5.
They're very different.
$5.
But they're very different. There's different mechanisms. I'm happy to talk about cash. There's different costs.
Well, not to
cash.
a wage earner, it's not.
But I mean, generally, there is nothing ever that is free. As you know, as the technology industry has indicated, if you're not paying for a product or service, you are the product. Now, that doesn't mean that there's always a charge to a consumer. Sometimes that's cross-subsidised. I mean, I know you're familiar with the NPP. That's been funded by the banks. I think we've invested more than $250 million. It's got to be more than $1 billion. That's a piece of infrastructure, which at the moment, yes, that is free from a consumer perspective. But in effect, that is cross-subsidised somewhere else.
Sure.
It is somewhat analogous to if the government spent $50 billion on NBN, you wouldn't reasonably expect to provide that for free. It's just the costs of where these services actually are charged and where is the most appropriate. So businesses are paying less using electronic payments than cash. I don't think those facts are in dispute. In this case, it really comes down to whether the lower costs of those inputs are being passed on to consumers, whether the cost of acceptance is as low and as efficient as it could be, whether the surcharging, which is supposed to be the reasonable cost of acceptance, is the right amount. And these are all issues that the Reserve Bank is looking at. I mean, we have, approximately the cost of acceptance on debit interchange is 6 cents. I think that's the lowest anywhere in the world. It's a weighted average of about 50 basis points on credit cards. The cost of acceptance would be, across both of those, probably about half of 1%. And so it's very difficult to make comparisons where it's just not like for like. I can assure you there's been a lot of downward pressure on lowering the cost of payments. There's been a lot of investment in making the payments infrastructure much faster, cheaper in this case for consumers. There are also risks associated with that. I mean, if there's one thing that the NPP has certainly accelerated, it is that with real-time irrevocable payments, there is no chargeback, dispute mechanism or recovery. And I mean, just to make that real, so we send about 20 million payments every day. We would, over the course of a year at the moment, be processing about 5 million disputed payments over per annum. So, and the largest contributor of that, ironically, would be Apple. So you can imagine everyone who's paid something electronically where there's I can't remember what that is, or I didn't get the goods or services. There's a whole process around that. The dispute process alone would cost $100 million. So there's definitely benefits associated with electronic payments. I think it should be tested, and I know the RBA are going to test whether the current levels of interchange are set at the right level, notwithstanding they are very low by global standards, whether surcharging is appropriate, whether that, and what that sort of impact would be, because effectively we don't receive any money from surcharging. The surcharging goes to the small businesses. Now, I think all of those factors need to be weighed up. There's been substantial investments in the payment infrastructure. I don't say that begrudgingly.
The surcharging goes to small businesses to pay your merchant fees.
To offset the costs that they no longer pay in the context of cash. And I understand. Yeah. I mean, I deal with businesses every day. I know how challenging the current economic climate is and inflation, and particularly for smaller businesses. So I certainly, I have a lot of empathy and understanding of that. But I think some of the facts that are often furnished are, either grossly exaggerated or inaccurate, including the cost, which has been sort of reported at $4 billion. That number is just simply wrong. And we're happy to show you the workings and the calculation of why we believe that's at least overstated by 3 times. It is a complex area between interchange, issuing as a card provider, merchants, which is merchant acquiring, where effectively you tap, LCR, NPP, all of the alternative payment mechanisms, the chargeback liability regime, how disputes work. It is probably one of the more complex areas of banking. I'm happy to provide as much information as you would like. We will work closely with the RBA, and ultimately, they will govern it. And it's not lost on me that one of the things that we mentioned in the opening is the PSRA, or the Payment System Regulation Act. Those amendments. I mean, that act hasn't been amended since 1988. And we're very happy to contribute to an ongoing review But I think it's critically important that some of these payment providers, which are imposing a more significant impact on the payments industry, are urgently reviewed, and the RBA is given the powers that they've been seeking for some time.
So I'll just go to some questions on your relationship with card providers. Having a browse on your website for personal accounts, it seems that you have an exclusive relationship with MasterCard. Is that right? So when you go, there's like 6 personal accounts and they all come with a debit MasterCard.
They would be our primary issuer in our Australian business. Visa would be our primary issuer, but we also do
MasterCard or Visa? MasterCard, yep.
Visa would be the primary issuer in our New Zealand business. Visa do a number, though, of issuers as well. So they don't have the same volume as MasterCard. Obviously, then it's co-branded with EFTPOS. So, I mean, we have a relationship, as you would expect, with every card issuer. But yes, there are currently more cards on issue from a debit and credit perspective that as the underlying issuer, MasterCard.
Okay, so describe your commercial relationship with them.
In what terms?
So do you get paid for this arrangement? Do you get paid per card issued?
No, you don't get paid per card issue. And look, if you ever want to while away some hours, looking at the way the international card schemes, I wouldn't say it's not a simple thing to summarise, but
nothing's simple, Mr. No. Cash isn't simple, card's not simple.
Cash is a lot simpler.
We agree on that, right?
Simpler,
well, yes and no.
But broadly, there are fees. Well, maybe it's almost easier to. Customer pays, let's say I'm tapping. The terminal that I'm tapping, depending on what the product is, I may get the terminal for free. There may be a rental on that fee. There'll be so someone, you will pay. This is effectively your 8 cents. Then some of that is provided or given back to the issuer in that context. Some proportion of that would go to the acquirer or the provider of the...
I'm aware of the nuances there. I just kind of want to understand your relationship with MasterCard. It seems to be that there's some sort of exclusivity do you get paid for that exclusivity? Like, do you benefit from...
We have a commercial relationship with them. We have a commercial relationship with Visa. Yes, we are paid. I couldn't give you the... Sorry?
How are you paid? Like
in a variety of different ways, but effectively a proportion of the interchange that is charged, which clearly has come down significantly over time. I mean, that's the simplest way to describe it. There's more complex elements to it as well. It depends on what the card mix is. There's a whole range of different factors that drive because obviously the total interchange, you get a proportion of that.
Okay, so what revenue do you make off that relationship with MasterCard?
I'd have to come back to you precisely. Okay. I'd say 2 things. One, in our merchant acquiring business, which is where you see the merchant effectively tapping it, loses money. Lost money last year, lost money the year before. If you're interested, happy to go through the economics of that separately. On the issuing side, it's both then you have to think about it in terms of what the gross money that we may receive from the issuer, in this case at MasterCard, but it could easily be Visa. Secondly, what are then the costs? So just like in many other markets, some proportion, it's more than 90% of the economics that we're receiving on the interchange side, we basically give back to the customer in the context of points, often through the purchase of frequent flyer points. Qantas could be others. So depends again, gross, net. The margins, I suspect, aren't as large as you might anticipate. I wouldn't like to hazard a guess.
Okay. Would you be able to provide that information?
I'm sure we would.
Yep. So you don't get any scheme rebates or anything like that?
There's an element around scheme rebates, yes. Some of that would also go into, typically, they will make a contribution that could be used for investments. It might be investment. We might use those dollars to invest in fraud, in technology, those sorts of investments. I'd have to look. It's been some time since I've looked at the structure of the contract, but there would be multiple elements.
Do you report any of these incentives or rebates or
everything
income?
is in our financial statements.
Okay. All right. Now just talking about EFTPOS debit in particular. So as far as I'm aware, all four big banks, but for your purposes, the CBA co-owns Australian Payments Plus, which is FPOS, NPP, BPay, all that stuff. And you've got a board member on APP. Is that correct?
That's right.
So how does this co-ownership work for you? Like, I understand they charge a surcharge, which you then pay APP. Like, do you get the same type of commercial arrangements from them for issuing cards, or?
Yeah, I mean, they wouldn't be identical, but I mean, substantially, there'd be a commercial relationship as you would expect in place. Yes, there's industry ownership. I can't recall what our precise share of ownership would be. There was obviously then a number of mergers across the entities that you referenced. What was that, a couple of years ago? And so I guess as the administrators of that scheme, and we, along with others, think it's very important to have a successful and competitive domestic scheme. We don't want to be entirely reliant on the international schemes.
So would you say your costs, the bank's costs in dealing with an FPOS transaction, are less than the bank costs in dealing with a Visa, MasterCard debit transaction?
I don't know that I'd make that conclusion. The mix is very different as well. So, I mean, the domestic or the FPOS is not sort of at parity on e-com, so there'd be a much greater proportion of e-commerce transactions would go through one of the international schemes. I mean, I'm not sure which part of the costs. I mean, I think the sort of directionally it'd be substantially similar. I mean, FPOS has reduced fees, which has also, over time, over the last several years, which has seen the international schemes also reduce their fees, which is...
The RBA says that, FPOS is lower than Visa and MasterCard debit. So does that reflect itself in your costs for...
They may be referring to that in the context of the interchange, which depends, again, on the transaction mix. I can't remember the specifics, but there would be... I think for the smallest transaction types, they may be. Then there's a crossover point where they aren't. And it's obviously, it's a matter for the schemes to try to determine where they want to position the pricing, because, you know, in effect, they'll be more or less competitive at various points. And, you know, as is the case in any market, that's something that needs to be determined over time.
But in terms of your revenue or profits off interchange, like the little bit that you take, and you said that margins are low, and I understand that, do you make more off FPOS or do you make more off Visa
in
and
absolute
MasterCard?
Terms, because the transaction mix would be larger through MasterCard.
Per transaction.
I mean, I'd have to look.
Right. You don't know that?
I don't know off the top of my head.
No.
I'm sorry.
See, I'm just worried that, according to the RBA, the cheapest scheme for Australians to use is debit through FPOS. They consistently have the lower rates.
Well, again, it's been some time since I looked specifically at that, but certainly the last time I looked, they were...
So they're as low as 0.2% for FPOS, as low as 0.4 or 0.5% for Visa and MasterCard. This is for turnover of over $1 billion is what I'm talking about here. So, like, I'm happy to show you the graph, but...
Sure.
But
happy to look at it.
Yeah,
It
so
may
they're lower
depend
for
on what the
FPOS.
arrangement is. There's a difference between... you know, the largest turnover companies, think the supermarkets versus smaller business. The cents versus basis points makes a difference as well in terms of where the different transaction sizes are. I mean, I think FPOS have been very competitive. We think that that's good.
Well,
it's led to reductions in prices from the international schemes.
But they're the cheapest, and you don't have LCR low-cost routing switched on for all your merchants.
But
like, why are you pushing people onto a more expensive scheme by default?
We do have least cost routing enabled.
Enabled, sorry.
But we do.
48%.
Well, that's 48. I think it's 97%. It's available. It's 48% in use. But see, this is again, and even I think one of the, to recall, it was a speech about 6 or 8 weeks ago, and in two of the tables in that speech where it references the proportion of transactions that are available through least cost routing, there's a little figure at the bottom or a footnote that says this doesn't actually indicate lower cost. So, like, to give you an example, all of the customers we believe reasonably that are benefiting from least cost routing have been moved on to, in most instances, a simple merchant plan. So that's it. Our pricing at the moment is 1.1%. We cut that maybe 3 years ago. it's one of the lowest in market. One of the companies that's referenced as 100% LCR is 1.8%. So, I mean, I could simply offer that simple pricing plan. A lot of our customers would be worse off, and I would be at the top of that box saying 100%. The RBA understands that. So it's sort of, one measure. It's certainly not the important one. Then from within that, there is some aspect, though, with depending on what the merchant is, they do have preferences in terms of which scheme that they use. I can assure you, we've had ongoing dialogue with the RBA for many years, trying to make sure that least cost routing is available. There is not inertia being shown by customers. We're not relying on that inertia. We're trying to make it available to the customers where it makes sense. As I said, we've substantially cut our fees, but it also, as a matter of fact, if we just increased pricing and pushed everyone onto a plan, even though a great number of them would be worse off, we'd also be sort of at the top of that table saying 100% LCR enabled.
Does MasterCard provide you or your staff with any corporate benefits or corporate hospitality?
I'm sure they do.
Okay.
I have not availed myself of any of that corporate hospitality recently.
Dinners, sporting events, bottles of Grange?
Any sporting events, I probably have at some point in the past, but not for several years. Dinners? No. I mean, MasterCard as an example, I would see the CEO of MasterCard either in Australia or in New York. Don't recall that being ever over dinner, mostly in their offices or mine. That is not a significant component of certainly.
Are your commercial arrangements with MasterCard inhibiting lower costs at the checkout for consumers?
I don't know how you would draw that conclusion.
Well,
are you asking me or are you telling me?
No, I'm asking you. I'm asking you. Like
no.
You don't think they are?
No.
No.
Absolutely not.
Even though MasterCard debit costs consumers more than EFTPOS debit?
Well, depending on the transaction, I don't think that's true of all transactions. I'm very happy to provide that. And I'm certainly not a lick spittle for MasterCard. I'm sure they're capable of representing themselves.
I only choose
well.
MasterCard because that seems to be your preferred provider, that's all. So,
well, we have a larger relationship with them. But no, I think I'm sure they would speak openly that their pricing and margins have reduced substantially in Australia. It would be, as I said, one of the lowest cost acceptance markets in the world.
Is it cheaper for Commonwealth?
If something is free, something can always be cheaper until you go negative, but that doesn't mean it's not fairly and appropriately priced.
Is it cheaper for Commonwealth per dollar to trade in cash or digital payments?
Sorry, say that again. Is it
cheaper for you per dollar to trade in cash or digital payments?
It should be cheaper in digital. But it's a scale economy effect, Mr. Laxale.
That's why I said per dollar or per.
As I said, the cash in circulation, I still find this somewhat remarkable, is almost at the highest level peaks, even though the level of payments for cash has gone to, I think, 13%. We distribute about $4 billion out through our ATM and our branch network. We process approximately 20 million payments per day. So, as you would imagine, in any sort of fixed and marginal cost business, the marginal cost on an electronic and digital payment has come down substantially, and those cost savings have been substantially passed on to consumers.
Digital cost savings have been passed on to consumers?
Absolutely. All of the evidence will show. But again,
that's not a saving.
But no. Again, that is a.
That's not a saving. Well, that's more.
It's a false comparison. And look, I'm certainly not directing this at you. I find it somewhat alarming in the context of this is not about the Commonwealth Bank, but I see this now again and again, over and over. Businesses in Australia are being, represented in this false dichotomy that for a company to earn any sort of income or profit, it is therefore inferred often or directly related, and not necessarily by you, Mr. Laxale, but on a daily basis, as somehow being unjustly extracted from consumers. And I think this sort of continuing, often sort of fact-free rhetoric that's being published more broadly is very damaging. And I say that damaging insofar as I think it is really eroding cost, trust in institutions, in all of our institutions, and I think it's a real cause for concern. I mean, I've appeared. I think this is my 15th time in Parliament. Mostly in the House, many in Senate estimates. I have no issue. I'll appear as often as anyone would like, answer whatever questions that we can. And particularly in 2018, it's not about transparency. It's not about accountability. There were issues that we should have been heavily criticised for, and we were. But I just see too often now, there is, particularly in the external environment, sort of claims that are made that are just not demonstrably true. And I think that's weakening and driving sort of a fundamental distrust of across citizens. You must be seeing it. We are seeing it, and I think it's a real cause for concern. And I don't think the right thing is to sort of position things when they're sort of factually incorrect. As I believe that you are, but as I said, this is a much broader sort of comment. I think the policy that was announced yesterday is just insidious popularity, and I think it's a real concern. I think it's going to drive a fundamental distrust over the next decade, which should be a real cause for concern. I think Australia is a very special place, which we have inherited from others, and it relies on a rule of law and that law being upheld, and it relies on a sense of trust and civility and community sentiment. That's why Australia responds to lockdowns, responds to vaccinations. It's very unlike many other countries and economies. And I think the internet has obviously accelerated misinformation, but I just see too often there's just not enough onus being put on people that are furnishing facts where it is what they describe as facts, where they're just demonstrably false. These claims of gouging and leading to CPI, that's just not right.
Thanks for that commentary, Matt. I am presenting facts here, right, to a consumer.
It's not a like-for-like comparison.
It's money that people earn, right, and they buy the same thing, and it costs them different, and that's what I'm trying to get to the bottom of.
Well, and hopefully, over the last 20 minutes, I've tried to at least illustrate that the price of the coffee is different.
Thanks for your evidence. Thanks for your evidence.
You're welcome.